should also say that my pronouns are she, her, and we are very honored to be here on the ancestral and ceded traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And so we have, Leyton doesn't really know what's in store for him. I have some questions prepared. We're just here. We've told him we want you to tell stories. So maybe first I will get Leyton to introduce himself, and then we'll launch into some questions about Leyton's community engaged research.
Okay. I'm sure lots of the pieces of me will be revealed through stories. Hi, everyone. This is Leyton. My name's Leyton, and I am white, settler, queer, former teacher, but always teacher, researcher. And I live here on Syilx territory, but my office is in Vancouver and my main place of teaching is in Nelson. So I live in between, and I just drive 4.5 hours either direction, depending on where I need to go. And I have a research chair in rural teacher education. And so that's also part of me. I spend a lot of time on the road.
Yes. Right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to our people in person and those joining online. I see more people popping up. So we are doing multiple cameras and things streaming today. So well, if there's any problems hearing us online, please let us know. Okay, well, our first question then is about when did you first know you were interested in research? And then how did that turn to community engaged research?
Great question. I was a teacher in inclusive education. Back in the 80s, we called this special educators. And my parents are both blind. And boy, it already goes to the autobiographical piece.
That's why we're here.
In the 40s, folks who were blind and deaf didn't get to stay with their families. If they wanted to go to school, they had to go. So my mom's from Galahad, Alberta, 196 people. My dad's from Steinbach, Manitoba. Didn't speak English.
I didn't know. I have so many relatives here there.
And Brantford, Ontario is where blind kids went. So I have this kind of piece that's ingrained in me from my parents, which is make change because no one else is going to make it for you. And so I remember as a inclusion teacher, I was talking about this work I was doing in my school, and someone who had a grad degree was in this session with me, and she said, "Oh, did you do your master's on that?" And I said, "No." And that kind of helped me understand that the research piece could be part of the activism or advocacy or change-making work that I did.
Very cool.
I think that would be and I was somewhat into my career at that point. So I didn't have like a research awareness until someone said to me, "What you're doing
sounds like research.
Should be researched."
Right, yeah. And then where did you do your master's? What did the topic end up being?
Great question as well. So I grew up in central Alberta, Red Deer, Sylvan Lake area. Went to university in Edmonton for my teaching degree. Then Ralph Klein invited me to leave Alberta.
And he
laid off all nurses and teachers in our first 5 years, and that's how I got to BC. So I was here teaching in BC, but I was in my later 20s, and as somebody who grew up in a faith-based community where a queer identity was not a welcome thing, it came to the point where I needed to finish my coming out process with my family. So I went back to Alberta to do my master's, and I flew in. And that allowed me to spend time with my parents and my other family members. And so I was doing my grad degree and becoming more of my full self.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks.
And U of A was a great place for me to spend my time doing my research. My research has kind of had these intersections right from my master's, right from my bachelor's degree. Literacy, inclusive education, and then collaboration. So my master's work focused on working with high school kids who had not been successful the first time they took English 10. And so I worked with a grade 10 class that I taught in the summer, who had all not had a successful first pass. And interestingly, almost all the kids in the class were kids of color.
Wow.
And so kind of looking at and understanding, creating access points for kids who maybe were valued for their funds of knowledge, and then designing my teaching and my writing practice, specifically teaching writing, in ways that they could write from their autobiographical perspectives, and maybe understanding a bit that some of their dialects were fluent English.
Yes, yes.
But were connected also to their cultures and their regions.
Yeah, very interesting about what you said about making sure that other people's Englishes are acknowledged, because I'm just going to give a shout out to my PhD student who's on the call. Emily Camo is leading workshops on that here for graduate students in February, I believe. Emily can give us the dates and info, but if you're interested in that topic and as a grad student, then please check out Emily's workshops that are coming out at some of the funding for diversity and inclusion for graduate student-led workshops here. So very relevant, and it sounds like you were doing it very early on.
I was a middle school and then a secondary teacher. And I would say there's been a lot of research in the younger years at that point in the 80s and early 90s.
But not for high school.
But looking at that work in high school, there was a lot for me to draw on that wasn't research done in my age group.
Very interesting. So my next question then, and you've already started talking about it, which is great.
Can't help myself.
Storyteller, is about what community engaged research means to you.
Wow, these are just not small questions.
I know.
What does it mean to me? Maybe not from an academics perspective, because I write about it a lot, but maybe from a lived perspective. Could I start there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Community engaged research is work that's done in partnership, in relationship. And so it's a project that's co-created with community, often directed by community, about a gap or a need or a question or a tension in that community, and then working together to design and enact that project, usually in place or in situ. That's an academic-y sounding word. Little Latin for fun. So that for me is the central piece of community engaged research and community-based research is, but engaged in particular is that the engaged word is that there's a sense of ownership, participation, it's active versus passive. And then for me as a researcher, it's supporting, a lifting up, whatever I can do within the relationship to help that happen. Often it's like getting through the ethics board, or going code switching, like working with the language and the ideas of the nation or the group and then also translating that sometimes in the ethics work, or to get the funding to often get grants. My job is usually to get the grants, to get it through ethics, to welcome in and support grad students to be part of that work, but really centrally around what is it that the community is asking for, and they, as much as possible, help define the research question. Even if I phrase the research question, it's something that we're creating together.
Yeah, thanks for saying that last part, because when we've talked about in my class is that there's this continuum, and sometimes we come in with an idea and then we let community members help us decide like how that will come out and how they would like to word it, right? So if there's an issue or something, so yeah, that's great.
I would say for me, at least at this point in my career, like I've been doing a little while now, there's probably been I've probably been on that continuum, but I'm now at this place that I'm seasoned but not near the end of my academic career. Where maybe it's also, once you're in relationship, then it's more likely that folks can co-create, but that going and asking has a different dynamic than being asked. Yeah, excellent. It's so relevant to what we've been talking about, so I'm really glad we're recording this, so the future person teaching my class will be able to use this. I can't wait to hear how I've used. Okay, so my next question is, when you think about when you began doing community engaged research through to your most recent projects, which you've talked about, can you tell us some of your most important learning moments? Okay, yeah. So people are working really hard here. I could add questions if that helps. So like, what was the context or the project? You have one, you gave us lots of photos, so I assume that those were some of the ones which we don't have up for today, but they were on the poster if you saw it. If I go back, I would say my dissertation research was my first community engaged research project. Okay. I had already enacted a pilot in partnership where Celia's joining us from, so on Vancouver Island, in partnership with a group around writing workshop. and I presented on that pilot at an international conference, and someone I knew from the Northwest Territories was in that session and had brought someone with them, and they came up to me and said, we'd like to do something like that with us in the Arctic.
Yeah.
And so that was what became my dissertation study.
Right.
So I already had an idea. It was connected to my expertise and my practice. It came from a question I had. I had done a pilot study, but then they heard what I did, and then we co-created what it would look like in that context.
Right.
And that became my dissertation study, because it moved from something I had defined as something I thought was important and I had attention around, and had experience from my master's. Like my PhD did come from my master's. It was still around writing practice and diversity and inclusion and collaboration, but then it really became about collaboration.
Right.
Because then it was this thing that we made together, and then the teachers in the study also were part of it. After every session we had together, I'd fly up and be there for 2 days in the school district, because it's far for folks to come.
Yeah.
So then these teachers would be released for 2 days,
Wow.
because they could travel in and be there together. But the last half day of every session was, where do we want to go next and what's coming up now? And I would often get wonderfully long emails in between sessions from people who are like, I just want you to know this. And that was my lived experience of community engaged research, without even maybe having that label.
Right. Yeah.
But it came more from like a lived value and principle and opportunity. My pilot was really rich because I was in relationship with those people.
Right.
But the dissertation study was much richer, because it really came from, we want this, let's make this, let's try this, let's figure it out.
Yeah.
More recently, so 15 years later,
Sure.
I think well, what I loved about that first one was like being at this conference, seeing this Frawley, my friend who's a colleague, in the audience waving, and not knowing that she was sitting next to her big boss. And then they came up after and we went for coffee and hatched this, and that was so exciting to, I would say, engaging in work maybe with more of an anti-racist lens, or learning about Indigenous ways of knowing in collaboration. That has been required me to be much slower. So even though I'm much more experienced, the partnership development and relationship development is much slower. If I see this responsibility that I have, but I have to spend the time building the relationships. And so the Welcoming Indigenous Ways of Knowing study and the Decolonizing Pedagogy studies, they emerged out of 7 years of doing inclusion work on another project before we were ready for these 2 funded grants to happen. And so you think if you do it before, it'll get faster later.
Yeah.
It got slower later because I'm extending myself and working in communities that I don't already have a relationship with. So I guess it's kind of like I've learned not just to work with the communities that I have, which are amazing.
Yeah.
But also say, where else could I be working that I feel I have a responsibility to? But I have to learn and become trusted and respected, or even in some cases with some elders spoken to.
Right.
Like I have one elder who did not use my name for 5, 6, 7 years.
Wow.
And then let me know when it was time that
they will call you that.
I will, well, I'm in the room now.
Right. Yeah.
In a way that's not me coming with what I want, but me more being able to, I've demonstrated that I'm listening.
Right. Yeah. And those relationships are always so different every time you meet a new community, right? So even if you've been doing community-based research for years, every community's relationships are different. At least that's what I found.
Well, and yes, and they're living.
Yeah.
Like Bonnie Lynn's here on the call. Oh, so Sarah, hi Sarah. And Robin. So colleagues that I work with, grad students that I've worked with, these projects that when a project lasts like 5, 6, 7 years, people change in the roles.
Yes.
And so it's also not like this is the project and these are the people. Every time the folks change, being open to like the renewal of the next year, like, oh, it's shifting this way.
Right.
This person's bringing this, this person doesn't agree with that.
Right.
So I've really learned that we've made a project, we keep it as is for the year. That's our cycle, like a year cycle. But then being open to the emergent nature of, if there are new people in leadership roles or participation roles, finding ways for them all to have a voice in how it's becoming. And that can be incredibly generative and also incredibly tricky, because this is the study, but now it's becoming this. And so folks who were involved early
Mhm.
have really invested in this, but how do we welcome folks who now have roles or feel comfortable offering their input or advice, and then allowing things to grow and change, which is not kind of our traditional funding model. It's like submit for a grant, get the grant, do the research.
Yeah.
So how do you explain it's an emergent paradigm that's based on participation?
Yeah.
And the more we're in relationship, the more people often will direct it and say, I think we need to be outside more. I think this is actually a big barrier. I trust you enough to share this. And that means that I don't feel safe. Right. So what else can we do? And I'm thinking, what have we been doing for 3 years?
It was all leading up to the.
It was, but I can also see,
right.
Again, how do you say that? You know how we talk about like research and ethics and like say, you know, the creed, first do no harm. I've come to understand there's always harm being done. And so it's a bit like visceral right now, right? Which is like, so then you have to say, okay, what can we do? What can we put in place? But even though we plan to be so ethical, that doesn't make people feel like they can or would or should share things, especially if they're already like structural or historical, even relational, a power over issues. Yeah, it's been a very humbling. And I feel pretty privileged that folks have shared with me. I've now learned also to just give my phone number, not to call, but to text.
Oh, okay.
And so sometimes people will live text me during a Zoom meeting.
Wow. Okay.
That was good.
Okay.
You didn't do well with that.
Right. Oh, feedback.
I'd like to say something.
Right.
But I don't feel safe to say something.
Right. So I'm going to text it to you, and then maybe you can bring it up.
Or I find a way. And so that is really helpful. Yeah. That was a long story. That wasn't quite a story, everybody. That was more like a
story.
A pastiche.
I guess one thing I wanted to come back to too, you talked about how things shift, and you talked about your dissertation research and how you would fly out for 2 days. And so sometimes, especially from the discipline I'm from, so for those who don't know, I'm an anthropologist, and we have this tradition within anthropology that you go and live with the community for a year so you can fully understand and embed yourself in that community. I never did that. I would go and visit, and my visits tended to be a little bit longer. So when I was doing my doctoral research, I would go for 5 weeks at a time or 6 weeks at a time. But how was that process? And I know you mentioned earlier you drive across the province because you're going to visit community as well. So can you talk about the time that you spend there and how that impacts maybe the relationships or
across projects?
Yeah, or just even from that original one, like how you said people would email you in between. So you're still able to keep that relationship going even if you're not there. But sometimes for me at least, being there is when everything happens.
So my dissertation study happened because those folks came up to me and heard me present the other project. I already had a relationship. The relationship came from 2 universities ago. I worked for Simon Fraser University, and I led field programs that were in situ in remote and rural communities. So I would go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a time, right at the end of the school year. And in the north, it ends a little sooner. So like mid-June to early July, and spend 3 weeks in community learning. So that's how I knew those folks. And then the program lasted began one summer, a middle summer, and an end summer. And then I was connected to them back then. Online. We didn't have, I don't think there was Zoom.
No.
It was Skype. People, it was Skype. So I think in terms of that project, the relationship with some folks was long term. And then when I came, I was there longer than the 2 days, but the 2 days were when the teachers were able to be there with me. So then I'd be there for maybe 10 days and visit their classrooms and spend time organizing with the leaders. But to release these groups of teachers, the design was quite beautiful, where it was a support teacher, it's like a special education teacher and a classroom teacher partnership from each school. And so they normally would not have been able to come together because they're in different Arctic communities. So it did bring them together to be together in a way they weren't normally together. Lots of those teachers 20 years ago are either retired now or they're in leadership positions.
That's interesting.
And folks who didn't necessarily think of themselves as heading towards leadership. And I think of one particularly very quiet teacher in that study, very thoughtful, did really good things in her classroom, but didn't share much. And even it wasn't until the end of the research, she was like, because you could participate
Right.
you can participate in the project without being in the research. How about that as like a principle?
That is a very good principle.
And so one teacher who participated at the end said, okay.
They wanted to see how it was going to turn out. Yeah.
For lots of
reasons.
Great reasons.
Right.
But she's now 20 years later in still a teacher role, but a helping teacher role. So she's found a informal leadership role where she's supporting colleagues in a way that all that incredible practice that she did is now supporting others, but in her very quiet, humble, gentle way, which is quite different than the hello, look at my good things. And people do respond to her. More educators, colleagues respond to her with her quiet leadership side-by-side style than some of the folks that are like,
more showy.
I won't go to a workshop.
Right.
But you can come hang out with me and my kids in my classroom.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. All right. So that was an important learning moment. I guess one of the other things, is there anything else you want to comment on about learning moments? So you commented there about people can participate, but they don't need to be part of the research, or something else of all of your research projects that you saw, like I learned something there and then I took it to a different project.
So many learning moments.
Okay.
One of the incredible things I've been able to do these last 6 years is we had this project in the South Okanagan called Through a Different Lens. And so teachers, again, a project involved in partnership through the Vancouver Foundation, which funds community, like the funds actually go to the community, not to the researcher. Quite a large grant. And in that project, it was started by teachers. It was all about the lens that you're changing your practice through is a student who is not having success in school. And so you look to them as the expert to teach you. You get to know them, you ask them about their strengths and their interests and their passions, and then from getting to know that student, you change your teaching, not just for that kid, but for everybody. So that kid is helping change school for everybody by making it more accessible or meaningful or whatever. So that project lasted. I had these wonderful partners I did that with, and that's what led to the project. Always had often the students that we were learning from were Indigenous students, boys who had behavior challenges. Like there was not a great graduation rate for that cohort of folks. So after 7 years, the local nation said, we'd like to formally partner around this. And as we designed it, of course, I knew more at that point than I used to know. And Indigenous colleagues, Dr. Sarah Florence Davidson, became the co-investigator of that project. So doing research with an Indigenous colleague as an equal has been profoundly powerful, because she'll just give me advice. She'll just be like, don't speak now. Or, when you said that, you should really think about that from this perspective. Or she'll also give me what worked. And so I've had so many powerful learning moments with Sarah, because we have this relationship where we created it together, we planned it together, we've enacted it together, but then she can also help me see what I can't see, which of course participants do. It's also something I didn't really think of in community engaged research, which is like, the more I do research in partnership with colleagues, because you know how you're the principal investigator or the lead investigator, I've learned that it's richer to do research, not just with community, but also with scholars from those communities, or who have perspectives that are not my own, because they'll give me direct feedback that maybe others wouldn't give me. And that really shifts sometimes my language, how I facilitate something. And then we have cycles, like I think I said this previously. So like a monthly cycle, but then a yearly cycle. And so sometimes we can really significantly change what's going on by stepping back together. And then lastly, I should think about how to phrase this. It's a recurring theme now, is sometimes the violence that's done in research to my colleagues and graduate students from non-dominant backgrounds by things that folks from the dominant community say just in the interview,
right,
that do psychological violence.
right,
So how do we think about safety? And so, you know, now we think about, as we go into the interview cycle, the grad students used to do the interviews. Sometimes it's maybe more appropriate for me to do the interview than for the graduate student from that community having to receive the unintended harm
right. From the people who are being
from the people who are being interviewed, who have been part of the project all year, where you're thinking they really should understand this by now, and then they say things, which is what you do want to find that out in the research.
Yeah.
But how do we really think as a research team about
safety,
who's going to do that interview? How do we check in? What does that mean? Because just because it's a great finding doesn't mean that harm hasn't been done.
Right. That is a really important point. And I loved what you were saying about partnering. I think as people go along in their research journeys as academics, you partner more with your colleagues as well, because you've been doing that work. And so I've definitely seen that, and it's been so fun to bring people from different backgrounds together, because you're in a different community than your co-I or your That's a really good point about making sure that there's leadership and training and protecting people from what the participants might say. Yeah, I don't think I would have thought of that. So thank you for sharing.
And then learning it, what do you want to call that? Like iteratively, it's kind of like, oh, now we see this, like now we see that. Like several of the amazing folks that I do research with are on the call. And so we're learning together. But boy, that has really moved me from, I will put it all into place and it's going to work, to we'll put what we can into place. And then how do we check in to adjust our profiles based on what we're learning with an ethical lens?
Yeah, that's a great phrase. Joanne, are you trying to say there's something in the chat?
There's a question.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. No, that's fine.
So this is from Robin. Christine, Leyton, as you both work in more northern and remote communities, the question I have is how you might navigate how conspicuous you might be personally in the projects you are part of, and how you might navigate the way that resources may be more limited or more expensive, or distances or challenges associated with northern remoteness for assuring buffered supported research learning project settings.
Thanks, Robin. I do work in rural and remote communities, primarily rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. So Robin, it's a central lived experience for me. Christine, I'll let you answer too. Hey. First of all, writing the grants and getting the funds is incredibly powerful. Many of these communities don't have a university nearby them. So there's already less access to, like, researchers are usually like, oh, I'll work here, or I'll work where I'm from. So there is a certain degree of how do I say it? Casting the net wide, if it's possible, to be like, who might be interested, where are their relationships. So even just like creating opportunities for partnership with communities that don't normally have access helps bring money in. In terms of the budget, a big chunk of the money from the budget goes to research assistants, primarily like grad students, but there's also another chunk of money that can be things. So you just build that right in terms of what we have. The other thing is, often a research assistant needs to come with me to the community because there's not a grad student in that community who's local. And so that's, I think, a way of like supporting that work. And then as much as possible, just kind of like we do as community engaged scholars, my teaching and my research and my service aren't super separate. We really look, at least in the work I do, that this is work either that's already happening and can be supported, or so it's not like adding more labor to the folks in the community, but it's already the work that's happening that we're documenting or that they want to have happen, and then often supporting the institutions of that region, like the school board or the health board or the something board, to build into their budget or their plan the time or the opportunity for the folks who are maybe doing the local leading to do that. Or in my case, often it's like providing release for teachers and travel expenses to come together. That's my first thought.
Travel expenses is a big one, because at least where I work, bringing people together, even in Papua New Guinea where I work, where it's very rural and there's no roads and we bring people, like people from each village together, which they never have very rarely do they have a chance to do it. And often it's for religious organization meetings. And then because people don't have motorboats, they have to canoe there and it takes all day. So when we are able to bring people together, that's such a huge piece of it. So our budget always includes bringing time to bring people together, like you were saying in the north, where you brought the teachers all together. Otherwise, they wouldn't have interacted. It's funny about the conspicuous, Robin, because the first thing I thought of was the very first time I went to Atlin, where I work with the Tack River Tlingit First Nation. I rented a car from Subaru, which I've had a very long-term relationship. And then you could get relationships with the people you rent things from for your community-based research. So there's a gentleman who owns Subaru, his name is Raman, and his father is from Mysore, India. And I was going the very second year I was there, I was going to a conference in Mysore, and he introduced me to his friends in Mysore. So I went to this club in India because I'd made this rental connection. That is not the point of this story. But the first time I went, Subaru they have rent-a-wreck, because in the north, everything's, got a crack in the windshield and whatnot. And it was a standard vehicle, which I had only learned to drive like a little bit in the flat prairies. And it was a lime green car. So I did not know how to drive. And I was driving a bright lime green car, and I was very conspicuous. Like there's that anthropologist driving around who's like, screeching and grinding gears. And so that's what made me think of. But yeah, much of what Leyton said as well is what I tend to do as well. Bring people in with me, do what people are already doing, because the workloads are so busy all the time. People are doing so much in those communities.
The conspicuous idea was, Robin, I forgot to pick up on that point. I'm pretty conspicuous in some communities. I'm the white queer guy with the fancy car.
Right.
That just is. And I often feel self-conscious, especially with my car. But it drives me over the mountains, people. It drives me over the mountains safely in the winter. But some things I've learned is you just roll up your sleeves and like help. So you spend time in the kitchen, you spend time with the elder. If you're invited to the cookout, you come to or in the north, if you're invited to like the whale eating around the tubs with the gasoline fires, you go to or to see the northern lights. And so
you go to hunting camp.
And
you put your hands
you get on the canoe and you put out your shoulder because you don't have experience with a shotgun and you're shooting ducks. And but I think being there over time helps, because then you become like an extended member of the community. And so that maybe doesn't take away the conspicuous part, but it does build the trust part.
Yeah. Same. I'm very tall, very white. Stand out a lot most of the places I go for many reasons. Joanne, there's another comment in the chat.
Yeah, another question from Steph. I'm very interested in hearing a story about getting buy-in from your community partners, the good, the bad, and the challenges.
You have a good, bad, and challenging getting buy-in.
Well, maybe I'll shift to a whole different part of my research program that I haven't talked about. But I see Rochelle is here now too. As we do this work together. So, but I did talk about, how did I come to this work? It's because I grew up in the disability community. My dad was the chair of the Voice of the Handicapped in Saskatchewan in the 70s. And so did lots of incredible, important advocacy work. So in the last 10 years, Rochelle, I don't know, some years,
at least track of time.
A project emerged, which actually kind of connects Christine and I too, where I have an arts background in addition to my special education in my kind of generalist ways. And so Rochelle found this out, and she's part of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. And so there was a request from one of the organizations around sexual health for adults with developmental disabilities that folks just weren't talking about it, and people are having sex. And so how do we create, and always not in again safe situations, in empowering ways. And so she'd been part of another project, and so she mentioned this to me, and suddenly I'm part of a project that's doing one of my theater areas, which is devised theater, where you create the theater based on the interests and of the participants from the community to design a play that's interactive, to shift the community's perspectives. And I don't even know how I got in it, but that was fascinating
Mhm.
because, I'm working with all these now, an inclusion community living society.
Mhm.
It's not here, it's in New West,
Right. Yeah.
but there's a theater that's also partnering with us. I'm working with adults with developmental disabilities who don't have theater backgrounds, who have ways of communicating that are not often understood by other folk.
Mhm.
And so kind of work our way through developing a piece together around sex,
Mhm.
for developing consent. Folks who are participating in the project, which is to educate others, are also awakening to the possibilities and their agency,
Mhm.
and then navigating with particularly folks with developmental disabilities, but also their organizational partners and their families who don't always have shared understandings or approaches to agency, self-advocacy, even though everybody has good intentions.
Right.
And so I have to have, like, I'm in this researcher role, but I'm also in like this directing role
Mhm.
and this like supporting role. But sometimes I have to be the person who says something really hard
Right.
that can damage a relationship with either a self-advocate or a staff member or a family member. And yet there's often it comes to me to be the person that is decided that I have to say that. So there's like that weird blurred part. And so I have to then kind of work through the process of doing that as best as I can.
Right.
But sometimes this person will feel done unto, like poorly, because this person has not been treated well. And so navigating between people
Yeah.
often means that things won't go well.
Right. Right.
And that even when you work on things, you can't maybe get to being liked
Mhm.
because you had to institute some
Boundaries.
clarity or boundaries,
Mhm.
and that sometimes people actually have to leave a project because of something that they've done,
Mhm.
and that is hard to explain to the rest of the group.
Yeah.
And yet it's done because there has to be some kind of ethical line drawn.
Right. Right. It makes me think that often my students will comment. I think Laura just said this, and I'm doing a podcast for the classes, and I think it was Laura's podcast comment, the multiple hats we wear. And I don't think we go in thinking we're going to be the conflict managers, like that this is something, but it is that a role that you sometimes have to do because of your leadership position within that larger project. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I guess the question too was about buy-in. So was how that project is so diverse. So how did the buy-in occur?
I've got a great one.
Okay.
Michelle knows this one. Robin knows it a little bit. So within the theater project, within the first version, we've done two versions. The first one's about sex. I'm sorry. It was initially called Sex, Lies, and Citizenship.
Yeah.
And then one of the folks in the cast was like, I don't want a play about sex, even though the play was about relationships. So we changed it to Romance, Relationships, and Rights. And the self-advocates came up with that title. And then they also chose which scenes to be in based on what messages they wanted to send, but also their own comfort in terms of topics. Anyway, really rich and powerful. There was a self-advocate who came to be part of the tech crew and was moving because also when you're part of the project, you're also moving the set pieces while you're doing everything else. So anyway, so Rob was moving set pieces in the first production. In the second production, he moved to on stage. And so by observing and seeing, and because we do all kinds of feedback in the research, he's one of the two folks that folks speak most about because he's so funny and he's so he knows everything from Game of Thrones. He reads volumes of history, his autism. But he was just constantly adding little bon mots, little phrases into the performances, and then his scene partner has to respond. So Rob says, enjoy, it's set in a swimming pool, and he's the front desk person, the self-advocate, and there's this privileged customer who goes, enjoy your swim with the piranhas in the pool in performance. And then Dana has to reply in the moment, but the audience and this is someone who didn't want to act in the first production, who decided he might
like it.
He didn't even decide, he just kind of came he just came to the development process for the next one. And then he became part of the scenes. He didn't even really think he was becoming part of the scenes. We were just because in devised theater, you just try things out, and he had all these things that people responded, and he became the star of the show.
Yeah.
And made friendships.
Yeah.
Like when we sit in circle to debrief and we call it notes in theater, like what are we
Yeah,
doing?
take your
And
notes.
he's like making side comments and talking to everybody. And so there's something around staying open to the possibility, not directing that person's participation, but making space for participation to change as folks get comfortable. And similarly, there's another actor who started acting in the first production, moved to assistant stage manager because didn't want to be on stage. Then someone left the production and with not much else, he had to go on the stage and become that character and was a star.
Wow.
And then we went to the second production, and it took like 3 times of having conversations with me to finally understand he didn't want to be part of this production.
Okay.
And so he stepped out.
Right.
And not because he didn't value the production, but being on stage was nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
And even being in the wings, he didn't want to end up on stage again. And so there's kind of that building relationships, but doing so in a way that's also, I don't know, it's hard when one of your actors leaves a production.
It's hard.
You're like, what are we gonna do? But it works out.
Yeah.
But if we're not giving, maybe that's it's a version of ongoing consent check.
Yes. Thank you for that. Great. Yeah. Which is important in your ethics applications. Yeah. I see a question in the room from Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay. You too.
My name's Lindsay Dupre. I'm a PhD student at English Journalism. I'm just in town for a few days from Saskatoon. My question is in a bit of a different direction, but I'm really interested in the politics at play with the work that you both do, and I think we're at a really interesting and imperative time in conversations and work in Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, where many nations are having more oversight, creating our own research ethics processes and systems. And so I'm curious about how you navigate the politics in community politics in your relationships, and how you even in your own minds think about who you're accountable to, and keeping in mind that every community has very diverse perspectives and different opinions on like who has authority to form partnerships with academics and otherwise.
Sure. To do not total justice to Lindsay's question, but Lindsay was asking about, as you're developing and engaging with Indigenous communities, with an awareness of or a lens to Indigenous sovereignty, but also the diversity within Indigenous communities. Sorry, that camera.
Either way.
How do we navigate that? What does that look like? What's our experience been?
Like how do you take responsibility and make sure that you're guided by understanding of those politics, but also not get so overwhelmed by them that you're frozen, I guess. Yeah.
I can think of 3 different examples, so I'm not sure which one I should share, but the richest one I could think of is that moving to partner. I'm looking at Lindsay on the camera at the same time. I'll just look at Lindsay. Moving to partnering in that one project, like where we had 7 years already doing some work, and then we got to the place where the nation said yes. The band said yes, actually. The band said yes. And so then the education coordinator for the band was the key person who also has a background in education, K-12 education. She was able to help translate back and forth. What was critical is that, which involved me always asking. So she sat on the steering committee and actually facilitated some of the sessions, but she often would I don't need to that. Like I had to ask, and I had to make sure I kept asking, because she would just defer to say no, because that's always what happens. But her voice was critical. Other members, though, of the work of the community have different family relations. So within the culture, they have different understandings of the culture. It's still the culture, it's still the language. And so respectfully navigating, even on the steering committee, folks are like, oh no, it's this. Well, no, it's that, because they were raised by the different mentors within the community. There was a knowledge, the knowledge keepers and the knowledge holders and the elders, all were part of the community, but like making a space for respectfully hearing. And then, like I talked about earlier, you'd have a new knowledge keeper join because somebody left their role and somebody else comes in, and they were raised from a different mentor. And so we were able to keep moving forward, but we had to adjust what we were doing to include that new knowledge. in a way that also didn't discount somebody else's knowledge. And there were times that were tricky. Of course, that band is part of a larger nation. And so then there's also that piece as well too. So it's kind of understanding from the people who were partnered, in this case the band, what we can do or what's in there. Here's what we can do. And then respecting that versus like, but it could be this too. And then they're like, no, this is what we can do. And so it's kind of like, who have we partnered with? Who are we working with? The leadership changed a couple times. And so respecting that change in leadership, that's my most visceral experience. And those are also the people who, one of whom texts me on the side, another one, every time I give her a compliment, she's super uncomfortable, which is like, but also, I also understand it's important to recognize her. And so if I don't do that recognition, that's also not culturally appropriate, but I also have to be respectful of her as her an individual, which is like being acknowledged in front of the room by the white researcher is not really what she wants, but she also understands that's important. And she often, in the year-end interview, often, I wouldn't say she thanks me for that, but she always tells me what I've done right and what's important to do. And so it's kind of like, who are the people that you're working with? I wouldn't say it's a project that's a partnership with the nation in this case. It's a partnership with the band. And then the band is part of the nation. And so understanding, but I don't have a role to go to the different groups. My role is the people who are officially my partners in the work. And so I respect it. I work with it. And I've come to know a lot of knowledge and ways of being, ways of knowing, how the language and the people in the land are connected, how there's actually no word for people in the language that doesn't also have a letter that relates to land, and there's no word for land that doesn't have a connection to people. So I've come to these really incredible, important understandings. I have all the settler folks who are part of the target audience, like how do we welcome local knowledge into the school? And so then the politics around are part of what's there. Like they just are. It hasn't shut down the project. It just sometimes curtails some parts of the project.
Even like the relationship between the schools and leadership, like elected leadership, it can sometimes be contentious as well. And often, from my experience working in northern communities, often it is non-Indigenous folks who are in leadership positions in the schools. So there's all these layers of power.
Almost always, I would say in British Columbia, we can't say everywhere, in many places now, there is an Indigenous leader, not top leadership, but or Indigenous person, people who are kind of that entry point, but they may not be from that local nation either. Like it's a constant awareness of who are we working with in the nation? What's that relationship looking like? Are we really listening? I could try to tell not even a story, just a bracketed moment, which is sometimes what the school district or division wants is not what the nation wants. And trying to find the things that we can work on together. And then that changes. Sometimes it's more in common and then it moves further apart. Sometimes those accountability frameworks are guiding it. And so, yeah, I think the folks who are on the call who are doing this work with me in some places, it's not like this. It's not like it's getting better. It's like just constantly like, who's on the team now? What can we do now? And it's possible that someone will say it has to end. Yeah.
I saw Anisha and then Andrea. Oh, Andrea was first. Okay.
When you're doing this kind of work, how do you balance like this wanting to be inclusive and accessible to a variety of people who are wanting to participate or express an interest in participating, and balancing that with the group? Like if you have one individual, for example, who seems to be compromising the experience for the group, like have you ever had to ask someone to no longer participate? How do you navigate that kind of?
Every project, every like rich project, right? That's like in partnership. They're quite different. So when Lindsay was asking about like partnering with Indigenous communities, that's working in a local Indigenous knowledge paradigm, and from like and then when I'm working with the disabilities community, that's working with the disabilities community in terms of like, so it's kind of like What are the protocols? What are the local protocols? What are the community protocols? What protocol? Remember I talked about consent. So like in the theater company, creating that process, and then knowing, I think what I've learned now is I always say we'll have problems. People, if we're going to do hard things, we're going to have problems. So then what can we do? And so as best as possible, at least we set or co-create some protocols. Indigenous communities, the protocols exist. So it's like what protocols can be shared. And then it's about having processes to repair. I would say people, that one example I gave, somebody did have to leave the project during the year. It wasn't a question. In other cases, it's more that they tend to stick with you somewhat through the year, but might not come back the next year because they want it to be this, and they can write as long as the email they want and be as knowledgeable as they are. But if it goes against the wishes of the community or it's potentially doing harm, I don't write back a long email. Like if I receive like 20 points with like numbers written with great intention, I'll write back like thank you for sharing that information. Here's what we agreed to as a group. Either you're welcome to participate, or it seems like your participation doesn't quite fit here, and I look forward to other opportunities in the future. Those people don't typically speak to me again. And I encounter them because in small communities and areas, but I have to work from a place of maybe that healing could come, or maybe there'll be a future relationship. But if this is what we've agreed to, this is what we've done. I would say most people do kind of come back around. I don't know about you, but often in circles or projects that have folks who are from that community and folks who aren't from that community, meaning Indigenous, folks with disabilities, racialized folks, I feel I'm often the facilitator, even though I'm not always trying to be. And so it's about processes where everybody gets a voice, a turn, and then helping folks who take 67 turns be clear that. And so I just have to be clear. We have yet to hear from blank, blank, and blank, and we have 20 minutes left. And some folks are like, and I'm like, and if we've already heard from you, we're going to prioritize the folks that we haven't heard from. So it's just kind of like a protocol piece.
Facilitation is something I think that is important to learn, but it's not something we're actively taught. You kind of learn it as you go, right? And sometimes that can be challenging, especially if you are new to the community or new to that particular project, or and so relying on and going back to Lindsay's, I would say too, it's the people who invited me in that I am most accountable to. So that's, rely on those key partners to be the ones who tell you what to do in those challenging situations. Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn the camera here.
And I'm really curious because you have the background both in the education community research. So I was wondering, how do we bring this kind of community and community engagement into undergrad classrooms? I try to kind of incorporate different at the end of project, like either debates about social issues, or now we have forum. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, if you have any experience bringing this kind of because many of our undergrads probably will never go to grad school to engage in community engaged research, but it would be at least good to give them insight what can be done, how it could be done, mm-hmm. right? In kind of small miniature version of it. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about it, or maybe incorporate it in your teaching, or.
Yes. I do have thoughts and experience. I do find it incredibly rich that when folks learn about examples from the world about work that's done in collaboration, it can be paradigm shifting. Mm-hmm. What do you mean I maybe should collaborate with others and co-develop something? And so that has been really impactful in my teaching. Helping folks design projects, it's a big thing. You can't, I'm going to go do a project. I wouldn't say that's being engaged research. So there's also kind of where can I start? What can I do within the time that I have? But yes, I work that into my various undergrad and grad teaching. That thing I maybe wanted to highlight, which is I thought where we were going initially, maybe it's a different piece, Anishka, is just that in this time where the alt-right has really galvanized, I won't say it's specific to Trump, but certainly from Trump on, and also that class conversations around social issues can go bad places. And so I do my best to like talk about how can we talk to each other where we recognize we all have different ideas and perspectives, but that also things that can be said, we have to understand that they can do harm and do violence. And also I don't let conversations just flow. I have learned, and not all of my colleagues come from that place, and I respect their place, and because I often work on like in departments or programs, students often will come from one prof where there's a different approach, whereas I'm like, what's our way to discuss this? What's our protocol going to be when things go, when people get hurt? How do we repair that? And sometimes just in the last couple of years I've had to say, and that's the end of this conversation. And then I will have to return to it the next class and say, here's what happened. We have worked towards repairing whatever kinds of ways, but conversations about social issues aren't places where harm should be done, even though we have diverse perspectives. So I know it's a slightly different piece, but I have found that that has been central to now when I bring these examples in, you know, this isn't a place for like an anti-trans comment. This isn't a place for anti-Indigenous comment. And the trick is that many folks don't realize that that's what they're doing. So it's kind of like, we do this work. I offer examples of this work. We can have discussions about this work, but how do we, even as we think about them, recognize that we can't all know and we're all going to make mistakes, but it's also not okay to just throw something out there continually, that we have to think about what we're doing. So I realize that's three different parts, but.
Joanne.
One last question for Leyton, if that's okay, it's my own question. It's been so interesting to listen to all this, and in listening to this, you know, you've talked about you travel in communities, you are a conflict manager, things adapt and change, and there's a lot of, you know, kind of upheaval maybe. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the importance of, for people who are involved in community engaged research, to be centered or balanced, or have practices for kind of taking care of themselves so that they can conduct the research in the best way possible.
Great question.
Wow.
Just to close.
How do you take care of yourself?
Well, I mentioned my colleague Sarah Florence Davidson. So our partnership work together in decolonizing and indigenizing work has been really important for both of us to have each other. A third team member has come on, Nikki Yee, and so we meet regularly. We've actually now engaging in collaborative autoethnography. So it's like a new strand that we've added to our research, where we're like checking in and talking about what's going on and figuring things out, and so maybe supporting each other in some hard learning. I do, maybe not successfully, but I don't think there's a project I'm involved with that doesn't have a team, like a leadership team. And for grad students thinking about their research, I think there's like, who's your team? Like, but somebody has to tell you, no, like you have to get at least 6 hours of sleep, or you can't keep replying to that person's emails. Let me help you craft a sentence to stop that. Because the tough things can just keep going, and sometimes because you feel an ethical responsibility or a relational responsibility, you keep going, and you need somebody to be able to say, you've done what you can there, or here's another way you could say that. And then I do like my hikes and my dogs and my husband, so there's a certain degree of like, go for a walk. And maybe after your 2.5 hour hike, you'll either have let go of it or come to some decision or realize that you can't do anything about it.
That's true.
How about for you, Christine?
Good question. yeah, I feel like having that separation and being able to do things where you can take time away. And I work less on teams than you do, although I have had team situations, and being able to have that other person to talk to. I remember going to Papua New Guinea for the first time, which was very new for me. And John Wagner, who I went with, had been there multiple times. And we had a student with us. And I remember, just sharing with both of them what was going on. And we ended up, our student got malaria, which was very tense while we were there. And so just having that team environment where we could, and then the team has grown over there. So I think having teams or somebody who is doing similar work to you in a different, like even if they're not doing the work you're doing, but they can relate to it, right? So even if they're not on your team, they're doing similar things. So I think that's really important. Also getting away, taking my kid places, and focusing on him is always important too. Yeah.
Investing in your family.
Exactly.
It can be so grounded.
Yeah. I think we are out of time. So I know there are maybe some comments in the chat. So what are they, just other questions we can't get to right now?
Just one comment from Steph saying that she couldn't have asked for a more timely and perfect story for where she is in her research right now.
Oh, that's nice.
And from Robin saying thank you so much. A huge run, but this was perfect for her.
Awesome. Well, please join me in thanking Leyton for being with us today and being our first storyteller. Leyton was the perfect storyteller, I think, even though he'll say no.
Maybe we could just call it like rambles.
Rambles.
Rambles and rants.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful to hear your stories that, again, resonate so much with me and with the things that I am currently teaching and have taught. So I really appreciate it.
Well, I would like to say how much I appreciate your leadership, Christine.
Thank you.
And the SESI program has really benefited from you doing this work. And I know that many of the folks who are here or online took the grad course with you. And so I do think that's a great way to think that you don't need to be in the SESI scene to take that course. Or Rochelle always says to me, feel free to sit in on one of my classes because there's a literature. And so you don't have to make it up. You can at least work from the foundation. So you've helped us do that here.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to thank Harshita, who is our accessibility assistant and event coordinator today. And also, of course, to Joanne, who made this a wonderful fireside chat and brought snacks. So for those in the room, sorry, people online, you won't have our snacks in time to chat, but please do stay. And if you are here in the room and have more snacks. And yes, thank you to our team here at ICER and to Joe and Corbett, who's not here, but this was his brainchild to begin with. So well, thank you as well.